Women's poetry created in response to the First World War has a strong yet underappreciated legacy. During World War I, women served as nurses in battle zones and were vital to the war effort at home. In addition to the cultural expectations of maintaining the home and raising children, shortages in the workforce led women to unprecedented levels of employment during the war. Women carried out a variety of roles, most commonly working in the munitions and producing weapons for the battlefield. In addition to their critical efforts both at home and abroad, women faced the loss of their husbands, brothers, and sons, and also experienced the trauma of war in different ways. While their work is often overlooked, women created a vast amount of poetry during World War I. This poetry focuses on a range of topics, but some consistent themes that appear are grief and mourning, nationalism, and reflections on the new work opportunities available to women. There cannot be one broad generalization about women's poetry during World War I. Like men's trench poetry, there are a range of opinions, experiences, and cultural factors that influence each unique writer. The following poets are primarily women writing from the United Kingdom. One of the famous poems of World War I, and likely one of the most famous war poems written by a woman, is Woman at Munition Making by Mary Gabrielle Collins. In this poem, she begins with maternal imagery that quickly shifts to more morbid thoughts, as she describes the hands that once soothed and fed babies are now hands preparing weapons to kill other sons. Collins writes that women's hands should minister unto the flame of life, yet they are coarsened in munition factories. The poem gives some insight into the difficult shift to new roles that some women grappled with, as the cultural expectation of the woman as a nurturer conflicted with the job of manufacturing weapons. Another famous war poem, written by Jessie Pope, is titled War Girls and describes the new roles that were suddenly available to women. There's the girl who clips your ticket for the train, and the girl who speeds the lift from floor to floor. There's the girl who does a milk round in the rain, and the girl who calls for orders at your door. Pope goes on to describe the qualities of these so-called war girls by writing, strong, sensible, and fit, they're out to show their grit, and tackle jobs with energy and knack. No longer caged and penned up, they're going to keep their end up, till the khaki soldier boys come marching back. This poem demonstrates a more positive attitude toward the demand for women in the workforce. Jessie Pope celebrates the strong and sensible work ethic of these women and expresses optimism that women are no longer caged and penned up, but instead given the opportunity to work while the soldiers are away. She makes no mention of violence. Pope is also well known for the poem Who's for the Game, which likens the war to a game in need of players. She asks, who's for the game, the biggest that's played? The red crashing game of a fight. A clear example of glorifying war, poems such as these gave Jessie Pope a complex reputation. The war poet Wilfred Owen dedicated a poem titled Dulce et Decorum Est to her after she published Who's for the Game, not to honor her, but to convey the grim reality he was facing in the trenches. Many of Jessie Pope's poems fall under the category of jingoism, which signifies an aggressive nationalism that often appears during war to maintain morale. While some wrote nationalist poetry to encourage support for the war, and others reflected on their experiences in the workforce, other women wrote to cope with the permanent changes made to their lives due to the losses of brothers, husbands, and sons. One notable poet of the war was Vera Brittain, whose fiancé was killed in action in France. In her 1916 poem titled Perhaps, she writes, "Though kind time may many joys renew, there is one greatest joy I shall not know again, because my heart for loss of you was broken long ago." This is just one of many poems that conveys the grief and heartbreak of many on the home front who received news of their loved one's death. Poetry also played an important social role during the war. Women read each other's poetry, which validated their own emotions and contributed to a feeling of solidarity. Poetry provided women an opportunity to express their own ideas and emotions while the war raged on. Some women conveyed their frustrations about feeling stuck at home, being little help while the men fought. Poet Rose Macaulay, in a poem dedicated to her brother, Many Sisters to Many Brothers, writes, "In a trench you are sitting, while I am knitting a hopeless sock that never gets done." Of course, there were women not at all far from the battlefields, working as nurses. A unique lens comes from nurses in battle zones. In the United Kingdom, the Voluntary Aid Detachment, or the VAD, accepted women to care for the injured across Europe in different battle zones. One nurse, Eva Dobell, wrote a poem titled Pluck, which conveys the brutality of the war. She writes of encountering a teenage boy who is maimed for life due to his injuries on the battlefield. Crippled for life at 17, his gray eyes seem to question why. With both legs smashed, it might have been better in that grim trench to die. Dobell's tragic poem illuminates another consistent theme in war poetry, which is the loss of youth, something that she likely saw much of as a nurse tending to the dying. These poems are just some of thousands that were written by women during the First World War. These pieces provide a window into the various experiences of women at home as they contributed to the war effort, yearned for their loved ones, and served as nurses on the battlefields. Although women may not have been killed in the trenches, their experiences of war and the different trauma they endured are still vital to recognize. Women's war poetry contributes to the larger story of the First World War and how women coped, both at home and in the midst of battle zones.